morning, everyone. My name is Norah McRae, and I'm the Associate Provost of Cooperative and Experiential Education at the University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Canada. And it's my pleasure to be with you this morning to present the Assessment of Quality Work-Integrated Learning, or WIL, and considerations for the future of work. Before I start, though, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Waterloo, where this work was created, is located on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. And the University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. Before I get started, I wanted to provide a bit of a background on work-integrated learning and the definition and models as we understand them in the Canadian context. So first of all, the way we define work-integrated learning is that it is a model and process of experiential education which formally and intentionally integrates a student's academic studies with learning in a workplace or practice setting. It normally includes an engaged partnership between three partners: the academic institution, a host organization or an employer, and a student. And it can occur at the course or program level and include the development of learning outcomes that relate to employability, personal agency, and lifelong learning. And I would direct you to CWIL, that's our Cooperative Education and Work-Integrated Learning Association for Canada, to the website, and I can provide the links to that because the definition is there, as is this 9 types of WIL, because we've identified across the Canadian landscape these 9 types. There are apprenticeships, which really align with particular trades. There's entrepreneurship, where students are running their own business or startup. There's service learning, which really engages community partnerships and is usually of an unpaid and shorter duration. Applied research, where students are working on research projects within perhaps an industry setting or a research lab of some sort. There are internships, which typically in a program there is one internship. It's usually a singular event, which could be any length of time. There is cooperative education, which is the program that is very prevalent at the University of Waterloo, where I am from. So co-op has a very particular definition within the Canadian context. Work terms are full-time. They are at least 4 months. They are paid, and they are interspersed within the student's academic program. So they might do a year or 2 of coursework up front, then a work term, and then an academic term, a work term, an academic term, that kind of thing. So over the course of their time, for example, at the University of Waterloo, when they graduate, they might have 4 or 5 or 6 paid work terms of 4 months each under their belt before they graduate. And last year, we did 21,000 of these paid work experiences in 62 countries. Field placements is another form of work-integrated learning, and these typically are happening where a student is out for a brief period of time in the field, developing technical skills, additional know-how. Think of, for example, the geography student who's spending some time out in the field doing surveying or mapping, that kind of thing. Mandatory professional practicum or clinical placements. These are often in the health fields, nursing, physiotherapy. There could be education as well, social work. Those kind of programs are typically aligned with a licensing requirement. And then work experience is a bucket, and we call these all buckets to allow for quite a bit of variation, where each institution can call things slightly differently, but each of these buckets have these components. And the work experience bucket is one that it's hard to put into any of the others, but it still has the same fundamental connections to workplaces with the same desire for learning outcomes as stated. After we had defined across Canada what work-integrated learning was and the 9 different types, we felt it was very important to develop a quality framework. I'm going to go through this quite quickly with you and point you to the publication of a white paper that came out of the WorkLearn Institute, which is within my portfolio at the University of Waterloo, because we published this white paper and developed this quality framework that really has been shared quite a bit, and we feel is very helpful in identifying, regardless of which of those 9 types and how and who you're doing it with, that there are some quality components that apply. So let me go through that very quickly. And we call this the AAA framework because, to keep it simple, we've tried to to identify things according to the letters A. So first of all, there are 5 stakeholders involved in work-integrated learning: students, host organizations, educators, governments, and institutions. Typically, those are the 5 stakeholders, and they have their advocates. For example, in the case of students, their parents might be their advocates, for example. And each of these stakeholders, and here's the first A, each of these stakeholders have aims, their own goals, their own purpose, their own reason for why they are engaging in work-integrated learning, each of the stakeholders. And so the first part of quality is understanding what these aims are. So in very high-level terms, students, for example, often want to get hands-on learning. They want to apply their theory. They want to get some technical or soft skills. They want to become more employable. Institutions engage in work-integrated learning because it's sometimes used as a recruitment mechanism, a retention mechanism. They want to connect with industry. They want to show governments or funders the relevance of their curriculum. Governments, and again, this is very context specific. These are the typical aims as we find them in Canada. It may be very different in your context, but in the Canadian context, governments are very interested in graduate employability, how universities are connecting with community, what we're doing about closing skill gaps, how we're contributing to economic development, productivity. Employers are usually very interested in WIL as a form of recruiting talent, engaging their staff, and developing supervisory capabilities in their staff, for example, getting projects completed, connecting to academic institutions. And educators are usually very interested in WIL because they see it as a way to engage their students, deepen their students' appreciation of the discipline, that kind of thing, and an opportunity to renew curriculum. So given those aims, then the second circle, the second A, are what are the actions needed to be taken to reach those aims? So their aims are clear. Now what needs to happen so that those aims can be realized? And again, regardless of the type of WIL program, we've also come up with this acronym, PAIR, P-E-A-R, that identifies that these 4 components need to be present to ensure that the actions that are taken are quality actions that support work-integrated learning. So P is for pedagogy, E is for experience, A is for assessment, and R is reflection. So I'll go through this very quickly, and again, the white paper has it in greater detail, but basically there has to be some pedagogy that happens to set the students up with the right kinds of content knowledge or skill development required to be effective in a WIL experience. That has to happen before. Often there's some pedagogy that can happen during the experience to help them be even more effective, and afterwards as they consider what happens next or what they do next in their curricular journey. The E for experience, and you'll see that I've broken this down not only in a temporal way, what needs to happen to set up before the experience, during, and after so that it's a meaningful experience, but that each stakeholder has a role to play. So students, the host organization, the institution itself, all have roles to play before, during, and after to ensure that the experience is meaningful and substantial. A is for assessment, and I'll go into this a bit more later. But basically, before assessment happens, students and employers need to understand what's being assessed and why. And this right away introduces the complexity with work-integrated learning versus classroom-based assessment, because you have another actor on the stage, and that's the employer or the host organization partner. Then there's assessment that happens during the experience, and who's doing it and how it's being done and when it's being done, and all of that starts to become a bit messier during work-integrated learning. And then again, after the experience, what happens to that assessment and where does that lead to? And finally, the R is for reflection. We know that experiences without a reflection don't necessarily lead to learning. And so reflection is so important, and it needs to be set up beforehand so they know what students are aware of what needs to happen during the event. They're supported to have meaningful reflection, and then after, so that they know what to do with that reflection after the fact. Just like Donald Schoen's work, if you're familiar with that, reflection on, reflection for experiences. And then the final A is achievements. How you know the aims, you're undertaking some quality actions. How do you know whether you're achieving those things in a way that's helping you get to the aims? And so that's the measurement of achievements. And in this case, again, you can, each of those, the components of PAIR, P-E-A-R, there are some achievements that can be measured. There can be achievements with respect to the curriculum that's set up, or the kinds of experiences and the completion of those experiences, the sorts of assessments that are done and how well the students have achieved the goals. And with reflection, what kind of reflection has happened and whether they have resulted in, for example, ideally, developing the habits of mind that we want in our students to deepen their learning. So putting that all together, basically the AAA Quality Will Framework says that we have to articulate aims, accomplish actions, assess achievements, and then need to put into place continuous improvement so that our programs continue to be quality programs. And ways that we can gather information to know what needs to be improved is through some of these mechanisms. So student achievement records can give us a lot of information about what we might need to put into place to help students improve. There can be some program improvements that happen through curricular renewal processes or academic reviews. Stakeholder engagement is a great way to determine how to improve our programs. And of course, there's a great deal of data that can be analyzed to consider where there might be gaps and how programs can be improved. So that is the AAA Quality Work Integrated Learning Framework in a nutshell, and I would encourage you to read the white paper to learn more. So looking at the assessment of work integrated learning, if we come back to those 9 models and we look at PAIR, which we feel are important quality components, there still are differences because how those quality practices are enacted differ based on the model. There are huge differences that are important that relate to how much time is spent in the experience. Similarly, the different learning outcomes that are desired and how those all relate to creating the kind of learning impact we want from our work integrated learning programs. So a handy formula that we've come up with to help understand this is that the learning outcomes that are established in the program multiplied by a concept that we're calling intensity, which is made up of how much time is spent in that experience and the quality of the actions that are put into place, those PAIR pieces, lead to the kind of the learning impact that we're looking for. So basically you can have all these great learning outcomes, but if the quality of the program isn't very good or the time is very, very small, you're not going to get as much impact as if you've got good, strong quality practices and a lot of time as well as those learning outcomes, which makes sense. So let's look at assessment again, just for a minute and just circle back to work integrated learning assessment. So unpacking this according to the quality framework again, you'll see that before, during, and after there are things that need to be done. The student and employer need to understand what needs to be assessed. As I said before, learning goals have to be established and assessments have to be conducted. And again, there are decisions to be made. Who's doing that? And then after, what happens to that assessment? So let's look at some of these components. And the first one being learning outcomes. And different models of work integrated learning typically have different flavors or different emphasis on the learning outcomes that are looked upon or desired. And I've put some of these here, and these are by no means meant to be definitive or mutually exclusive, because it really, really, really does depend on the institution and the program in which these work integrated learning experiences are embedded. But just to give you an idea, so typically in apprenticeship programs, there are trade-specific skills that are being assessed. You know, if someone is in an apprenticeship to become a chef, for example, there's certain skills that are being assessed in order to get the various components of their training. Employability is a whole other range of learning outcomes, and they often show up in co-op programs, internships, work experience programs, of course, as well as others. So these aren't meant to be mutually exclusive. Again, I just want to qualify that. In entrepreneurship type WIL programs, often there are learning outcomes around entrepreneurial mindset and innovation and problem identification and ideation, that kind of thing you might see. Service learning programs, again, this kind of service to community mindset type learning outcomes, other learning outcomes you'd find from community engaged learning in different ways. Applied research, usually there are research skills that are identified. In the mandatory professional practicum or clinical placements, there are often profession-specific skills, again, usually articulated in relationship to a licensing body. And then in field placement, there may be some, for example, discipline-specific technical skills. I'll go back to that example of, say, the geography student. They may have to be learning GIS, for example, or certain surveying techniques as part of their field placement. In work-integrated learning, the other complicating factor, of course, is who is doing the assessment. So the academic program is always involved, of course, but then depending on the nature of the model of the program, the WIL model, there could be different players involved, of course. So in apprenticeship, you'll have the employer or the supervisor usually checking on those the attainment of those skills. In the case of co-op internship work experience, the supervisor or the employer is providing some assessment. The student may be doing some assessment as well. In entrepreneurship, there isn't an employer per se or a supervisor per se because the student's running their own business. So there might be a mentor that's involved. Similarly, with community service learning, there'll be a supervisor at the host organization. Often the student is engaged in self-assessment as well in service learning programs, and so forth. So you'll see that the other complication with WIL assessment is the number of people or the different inputs that are being provided into the assessment. And what weighting do those inputs have? Does, in a situation such as, say, an internship, if there's an employer who's doing an assessment and they say the student has done an absolutely terrible job and that student should fail, does that have primary weighting and the student should fail or not? I mean, those are the kinds of decisions that come into play when there are different actors involved in work-integrated learning, which does make it a lot messier than when one is creating one's own course and can assess students accordingly. The other, because work-integrated learning is occurring in a whole range of different contexts, and students are engaged in all sorts of different kinds of activity, then how assessment is conducted can vary as well. It can, there can be observation of students on the job doing something. There could be feedback that's provided from co-workers or teammates on the students' activities. The students could be doing it themselves. As I said, their supervisor could be doing it. There might be some knowledge and skill demonstration that's going on. There could be portfolios, e-portfolios, a whole range of reflective practices that students could be completing, journals and vlogs and blogs and reports, all sorts of ways that students are reflecting that are assessed in different ways as well. So how these assessments are conducted also adds an element of complexity. So these last few slides were to point out how work-integrated learning is a different kind of learning that has different considerations and contexts that need to be factored in order for assessment to be meaningful and authentic and helpful for all players. I now want to talk a little bit about the future of work and what that might mean for work-integrated learning and for work-integrated learning assessment. I mentioned that we have the Work-Learn Institute within my portfolio run by Dr. Judine Preddy. And Judine and her team did an extensive research project this year. They've just also published on this based on the review of the Gray literature on the future of work. And they reviewed over 32 reports and looked at what are the common themes that seem to be emerging about the future of work and what are the implications for us as we educate our students, and then specifically around assessing our students. So the 6 themes, and again, I'd point you to the report, you can read it in greater detail, the white paper we've published, but the 6 themes: advances in technology, of course, this is nothing new, automation, AI, robots, Internet of Things, all that kind of stuff coming and the implications for workplaces. That there's going to be a responsibility for adaptation to these advances, and that responsibility needs to be shared by governments, by educators, by individuals, by employers and industry. that everyone's going to have to develop skill agility and transferability of skills in a range of different contexts. And we've seen that right away with COVID, haven't we? That there's increasing importance of diversity and inclusive cultures and ensuring that all talent finds its way. Gig economy and precarious work is something else, a trend and a theme that's increasing. And this concept of employee versus organizational values and how important it is to be aware of our values and the organizations, what they're saying about their values and how that affects the retention and recruitment of people. So in the case of the University of Waterloo, we've taken this future of work concept and we've thought about, okay, so what are the skills under the area specifically of skill agility and transferability? What are the skills our students are going to need to be successful in this future of work? And we've come up with something we're calling the Future Ready Talent Framework. And the Future Ready Talent Framework is made up of these 4 categories: expanding expertise, developing self, building relationships, and designing and delivering solutions. And these areas are all ones that students, no matter what they're studying, need to be thinking about developing. And what we are now using as our framework for assessing their learning on their co-op work terms and their experiential opportunities, their experiences, as well as our career programming. So we want to see our students be able to develop these 12. You can see under each of the 4 categories 3 different talents, so 12 in total over the course of their time with us. And you'll see how they connect to the future of work. Some of these things aren't new, for example, communication and collaboration. But when we are looking at workplaces where we may be collaborating with artificial intelligence, for example, what does that look like? What are the skills that we need to be able to do that effectively? When we're communicating in remote work situations with teams made up of individuals from across the world, what does that look like? And so these are some of these things we will have heard for decades, but they will look different and show up different in the future of work. And then the way we're thinking of assessing is not just with respect to each individual co-op work term, for example. So a student has a work experience. How have they developed self, for example? How are they assessing that? How has the employer seen that? What are their evidence of that? But then how are we going to put that all together to assess them over the course of their program of study? And this is what we're thinking of here with our Recognizing Learning along what we call our University of Waterloo Work-Integrated Learning.
Your payslip series.
Where we use the concept of they have to be able to demonstrate that they know how, they can show it, and they can do it. And you'll see in this learning path, the first step is that we have some pedagogy in advance for them where they get ready for their first work-integrated learning. They have to do they have to know some material before they can even go out on an experience. Then when they're on an experience, they complete these future-ready talent assessments, and they have some professional development at the time, and we're working on a process where they can earn badges and micro-credentials potentially. And then we feel that they're ready for graduation and career when they have accomplished some degree of capability in each of those 12 future-ready talents, and they can demonstrate them by having earned a micro-credential. And then we feel that over the course of time, they've gone through this path, they're ready for their careers and we've set them up for a lifelong learning development path as well over the course of their career. So in summary, there's some challenges with assessment and work-integrated learning, which I think I've explained already. Each student is unique, each setting is unique, there are different issues with respect to benchmarks. There's the question of how much time people have now with COVID, the remote work-integrated learning and how one does assessment when it's remote and how that works is a little different. Obviously it's done, but it just adds another layer. When students are doing self-assessment, what that requires, and supervisors, when they are assessing, what does that require? How do we train them? How capable are they? There's such variety in supervisors. How do we make sure that there's some standardization? And then what do we do to measure assessment? Do we give grades? How much of a grade? Is there a pass-fail? Is it based on performance evaluation or strictly by what the academic supervisor has observed? And then what do we do with that assessment? Do we put it on a transcript? Do we have it in badges? Do we do micro-credentials? And what does that all look like? And how do we package it all up over the course of the student's degree so that when they do graduate, they have something that they can take with them that is meaningful both to themselves and to subsequent employers? I've posed some provocative questions, which I believe you're going to be breaking out into breakout groups to discuss. And I won't read those out because those are available to you, that I hope that my comments and then these questions will foster some meaningful contribution and conversations amongst you. But I would like to say thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. And it's been lovely to go through some of these ideas. And I really wish you very well on the rest of your forum, and that hopefully we can meet in person one day. And thank you very much.